Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Kira Epstein, the program coordinator for the new school at Commonweal. We are here today with our host, Michael Lerner. We're so grateful and pleased to have him joining us live on a webinar. And we also welcome Richard Heinberg back to the new school. In just a couple of minutes, I'll turn this over to Michael, and he will welcome you further and introduce Richard. We are recording this conversation, and we'll have produced audio and video files available. You can find all of our recordings on SoundCloud, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. I always want to thank Ken Adams, who makes this all run from behind the scenes. So thank you. And finally, thank all of you for your donations to the new school. Your support allows us to make these events available to everyone, regardless of their situation. And now I think we're ready to begin. Michael Lerner and Richard Heinberg, welcome back to the new school at Commonweal.
Thank you, Kira. And Richard Heinberg, what a complete joy to have you back.
Oh, thank you, Michael.
Richard, your new book, Power, Limits and Prospects for Human Survival, I think it's a really extraordinary book. And it's been greeted by many of our friends and colleagues for what it is. Dennis Meadows, who was co-author with Dana Meadows of the great Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, called it an impressive, sweeping, and thought-provoking narrative. Dar Jamal said it was impeccably researched and masterfully written. This book explains how and why humanity is driving itself off the cliff. One of my favorite quotes was from Chuck Collins. Power reminds us that Richard Heinberg is one of the most important public intellectuals in the conversation about society's future. Joanna Macy, our friend and colleague, described Heinberg's panoramic review of known forms of power as both sobering and inspiring. And there are many other quotes from friends and colleagues inside. But I'm so grateful to see others recognizing what I felt as I read this, which was that you've done something that I think is quite unique in the history of the literature on power, which is linked, I would say, more forms of power together in a coherent narrative than I've seen done before. Is that your sense? Have you seen anything as you reviewed the literature? Did you find anyone else who had taken this comprehensive an approach to power?
Well, if I had, it would have saved me a lot of trouble. The word power, especially the English word power, is very broad in its meanings. And I played with that because in French and German, for example, there are different words for social power versus physical power. But in English, the term really has very, very broad meanings. And again, I was able to play on that in order to bring together phenomena from the biological sciences, from the social sciences, and environmental sciences, and make kind of a coherent statement, if you will.
And I also detected, I'm sure you've reflected on this, a kind of what seemed to me a clear evolution from your extraordinary work on energy through the Post-Carbon Institute to looking at power. That it seemed to me that you were searching, beyond all the work that we've done on energy and the limits to how much carbon we can put in the atmosphere, to go from that focus on energy to a deeper and broader focus on power seemed to me, a completely understandable and in some ways logical development in your thinking.
Yeah, and it was a challenging development too, because I had to go outside my comfort zone in terms of research and writing in order to do justice to this larger frame of power. And readers can judge for themselves whether I was entirely successful in that or not. But I think it's time for us to look at the big picture. It's a challenge to write a big picture book these days. They don't sell well. Publishers don't want to publish them. But we're at a stage in our evolution, our history, and a stage in relation to what's coming next, where I think it's really incumbent on all of us who can to step back and take a broader look at what it is to be human, where are we going, why are we doing this, and what does it all mean?
Mm-hmm. Kira was kind enough to post your bio in the chat function. So it's long and distinguished, and therefore I'm grateful to have it in the chat so we don't have to go over it all now. But I do want to say that in the work that I and many others have done on the polycrisis, the great unraveling, the global problematique, the human dilemma, the end of the world as we know it, the great simplification, whatever we choose to call the present moment, you really are one of the most significant public intellectuals and thinkers addressing this. And we've been fortunate to have you at some of our gatherings at Commonweal for the Omega Network. And I often find as I read the literature that almost everywhere I go, you've been there before me, and you've commented on it, and so on. So it's just a great privilege and pleasure to continue to be in dialogue with you.
Well, thank you, Michael. That's very generous of you to say, and I feel at least equally thankful to be in your company.
Well, thank you. So what we're going to do for our participants and listeners is Richard's going to do a PowerPoint that will last 30 to 40 minutes maximum. And then we'll come back with an opportunity to talk with Richard. So Richard, over to you. We look forward to it.
Thank you, Michael. So this is the cover of the book. And my objective with this book was not so much to propose some new solution to our human dilemma. There are lots of those out there. My objective really was to arrive at some sense of understanding and wisdom of why this is going on, where we are in relation to previous human evolution, and so on. So wisdom is another big word, and I define it as prioritizing what's truly important from a long range perspective and living well within limits. So the book was organized around three questions, and briefly, these are: how have we, just one species out of millions, become so powerful as to bring the planet to the brink of climate chaos and mass extinction? I mean, we really have become extremely powerful. We move more of the Earth's crust annually just with mining than all of nature's processes like wind, rain, ocean currents, and all those things all put together. So we are the dominant force on the planet now. How did that happen? Second, how have we developed so many ways of oppressing and exploiting one another? Because that's also something really remarkable about our species. Other social species also have, pecking orders like chickens do, and inequality in that sense. But we humans have taken that to just an extraordinary extreme. And then finally, is it possible to change our relationship with power? Okay, so these are not unique questions. They've been rattling around in my head for a long time, and other people have addressed them in various ways. But I wanted to do it in a systematic way. And so what are we talking about? What is power? well, ask a physicist and she will say it's the rate of energy transfer. And energy, of course, is extremely important. We'll get to that in a moment. But we use energy to do things. So often when we speak of power, we're talking about the power to do something, like the power of flight or the power of speech or whatever. But then often we use the word power, and here's where different languages often have different words, as social power, the ability to get somebody else to do something. And even within social power, there are different forms. There's what might be called horizontal social power, the ability to self-organize to accomplish something, versus vertical social power, which is based on incentives and threats. That's the kind of power that an employer or a judge or a policeman might have. And of course, vertical social power has gotten embedded throughout society. And then we use the word power to talk about the power of ideas, inspiration, the power of personality, all these other things. These are all legitimate uses of the word power. And they're all related. And they all go back to energy, because without energy, basically nothing can happen. And so I do talk a lot about energy in the book, but I don't just stop there. So power is a thread that ties together a lot of fields. And I've been interested in all this stuff for decades, but once I realized I was going to have to write about all of these things, I also realized I had to get up to speed. So I bought and read literally scores of books so that I could get myself up to date with power in social psychology, power in cell biology, power in evolutionary biology, and on and on and on. And it was, I have to say, it was the intellectual kid in the candy store moment. I loved researching this book. One of the books, and I'll show you the covers of some of the books I read, one of them, which is here, Nick Lane's Power, Sex, and Suicide. Fantastic book. He talks about most of cell biology that we've studied in school, 20 or 30 years ago, was all about chemistry, biochemistry, which a lot of it, of course, still is, DNA, RNA, and all that. But increasingly, biologists and cell biologists are looking at energy as, the fundamental basis of living organisms and life processes. So this is a factoid from Lane's book. Gram for gram, the average organism is 10,000 times as powerful as the sun. That seems absolutely incredible until you do the math. And of course, the sun is incredibly massive. So you divide luminosity by mass, and actually living things, they're getting their power from someplace else, from the sun, almost entirely. Whereas the sun is creating its own power. Nevertheless, living things have gotten incredibly good at getting and using power. In evolution, the maximum power principle was identified early in the 20th century as the organizing or driving mechanism. Organisms within species, or species within ecosystems that are able to aggregate and use the most power for purposes of reproduction and obtaining food, tend to survive and leave more offspring and succeed. It's kind of duh. We all know that. But it was nice to see that it had been formulated as a principle and studied systematically. And so if that's true, then why isn't there just one organism that became supremely powerful and crowded all the other organisms out of existence? Well, it's because there are so many different ways to express power and different environments in which to do so. So you get, as a result of that, you get the immense variety of life. One of the of the books that I read in research that I really loved was this one by Richard Prum, ornithologist at Yale University, on the evolution of beauty. Darwin wrote a book on sexual selection in which he tried to explain the evolution of the peacock's tail, which he said made him very, very nervous because from a natural selection standpoint, this elaborate but beautiful tail would seem to be an impediment. It makes the bird more obvious to predators and so on. But for purposes of attracting mates, the production of beauty can become a kind of obsession for species. And this is true not only in animals, but also in flowering plants. Nature is intentionally beautiful. It's not just, we subjectively look back and think, wow, that's really pretty. Yeah, it is. But it's pretty largely because it's trying to be. And this will have more significance later on in our story. The evolution of human, specifically human power, there are antecedents for all of these things in previous biological evolution. There are other organisms that communicate. In fact, practically all organisms communicate in some way, and some of them are extremely good at it. We're just learning about the communicative abilities of starlings and crows, for example. Just amazing. But we humans then took that a step further with language, where we developed the ability to use these abstract symbols and arrange them according to rules of grammar so that we could express complex, abstract thoughts within thoughts, ask questions, talk about things in the future, things that don't exist, things that are entirely theoretical. And that has given us enormous power. And combine that with tool making. And once we had language, then we could not only make superior tools, we could teach other people how to make tools. Clothing, a tool, a set of technology that enabled us to live in all kinds of environments we couldn't have survived in otherwise. And then, of course, fire, which had tremendous implications for cooking food, increasing our ability to access the energy in food, keeping us warm at night, driving off predators. But then later on, as we get to fossil fuels, has even more implications. Chapter 3 of the book is about the evolution of vertical social power, which really goes back just to the beginning of the Holocene, or somewhat into the Holocene period, maybe 7,000, 8,000 years ago. Previous to that, we'd lived as hunter-gatherers, and in hunter-gatherer communities, there's generally horizontal social power. Some people have more prestige, but it's because they know how to do special things, or they've shown their knowledge of the environment or herbs or whatever. With vertical social power, I'm not going to explain here the process that's described. Again, just within the last 10 years, a tremendous amount has been learned about the origin of the first state societies, roughly 7,000 years ago. There's an excellent book by Yale University anthropologist, historian James C. Scott. These first state societies had kings, writing, metal tools, money, slavery, and they were extremely unequal societies. And we've basically been, ever since then, we've been trying to recover in one way or another. But they were very powerful in relation to other societies. So even though they were socially unstable because they were so unequal, because they had full-time specialists in violence and metal tools, they were very successful in wiping out neighboring societies. I mentioned that they were unstable, and this has been a feature of complex societies ever since. They're characterized by periods of expansion and retreat. Peter Turchin and his colleagues are doing the best work on explaining that instability. And it's really amazing what they've been able to do, assembling an enormous database of quantifiable information about state societies over the last 7,000 years, and the kinds of cycles that they go through. They're characterized by a kind of wealth pump. In other words, once you get social inequality, the people who are at the top of the social pyramid have the ability to arrange things in such a way that they increase their wealth and their social power even further. And so that wealth pump operates until it gets to a point where the society becomes so unstable that it's brought down by revolution, internal dissent, economic collapse, whatever. There are several things that can make it happen, but it seems to be more or less inevitable. So all of this plays out over the course of the last few thousand years until we get to about 200 years ago when we started using fossil fuels. Now, there had to be some developments prior to that, basically what we'd call capitalism, government protection for investments, incentives for innovation. By the way, all of these things were present about 1,000 years ago in China. Privatization was going on, lots of innovation. There was lots of coal lying around. And so China very nearly experienced an industrial revolution. History would have been very different if this had succeeded. But what happened next was the Chinese government decided that this was a threat and shut it down. So it had to wait another, 600 years until the Industrial Revolution in Britain and then the United States took over a process. And it changed. Using fossil fuels changed everything. This was the biggest power shift, not only in human evolution, but in the entire biosphere over the last several million years, maybe the last 50, 60 million years or more. This is what agriculture looked like before fossil fuels. This is what it looks like today. Before, it took 70, 80, 90% of the population working on farms to produce enough food for everyone else. Today, it takes 2%. So this is a USDA graph, farm jobs as percentage of total US jobs, which is very revealing. But of course, the assumption is that all those people working on jobs 200 years ago were working there as employees. Was this a job? No, I mean, jobs basically hardly existed 200 years ago. Yes, formal employment did exist, but the number of people who were employed was a very small segment of the population. Most people either were landowners and farmers or slaves in the US, and unfortunately, many other countries as well. So this is what energy growth looks like over the last 200 years. And we've gotten used to that. It's changed our expectations about the world. But growth is dangerous. Anything that's growing at 1% annual rate doubles in size in 70 years. Okay, at 2% growth rate, it doubles in size in 35 years. Well, the Chinese economy has been growing at 7% for the last 15 years or so. That means it's doubling in size every 10 years. How long can that go on? The answer is not forever. So growth is something that as an ecologist, as a systems scientist, one looks at that and says, well, that's trouble. Same thing with human population. As of September 2021, we're at very nearly 8 billion. 200 years ago, at the start of the fossil fuel revolution, 1 billion. So that's 800% growth in just 200 years. Extraordinary. And per capita usage of energy and resources has also grown 800% per capita, not total. If you look at the total growth in energy and resources, much, much bigger. So what did we do with all of this energy? We applied it to things we'd been doing before, like making stuff. But we realized when we did that we could make stuff so fast that the economy couldn't absorb it. The problem of overproduction was one of the factors leading to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And government scientists and industry representatives got together and they devised a solution to the problem of overproduction and underemployment. And it became what we call today the consumer economy. Using advertising and consumer credit, it's possible to get people to consume more stuff, to consume now and pay later. And that's how we've been keeping the economy cobbled together ever since. And with growth in consumption, we get more jobs, we get more tax revenues, we get more profits to businesses, more returns to investors, and everything is just hunky-dory. The economy became, for the first time ever, a thing to be tracked and measured with GDP, unemployment statistics, and so on. None of this was occurring prior to the mid-20th century. And growth becomes the overall goal. So today, if you speak to any politician, any economist, and they'll tell you growth is good. We have to have growth, of course. But while all of this is going on, which seems so good, we're seeing the unintended byproducts of growth appearing throughout the biosphere, with climate change, loss of wild nature, resource depletion, pollution, economic inequality growing during most of this period. That's a more complicated story, and I won't have time to explain it in detail, but ask about it if you're interested. And some smart folks realized that this was a story that would not, if it kept going as it was starting to go, it would not end well. And hence we got the Limits to Growth report of 1972. In the standard run scenario of which we see industrial output, population, and resources all peaking in the early part of this century, basically all hell breaking loose before about 2050. One other way of telling how we're doing is the global footprint, ecological footprint. We're using one and a half Earth's worth of resources on an annual basis. How's that even possible? Well, by stealing from the future, basically. Climate change is, these days, it's practically the only environmental problem most people talk about. And the assumption seems to be if we can just find a technical solution for climate change, then we're fine. And the technical solution that's most often proposed is just building a lot of solar panels and wind turbines. I suggest by the way, this is a book that a colleague and I wrote 3 or 4 years ago, where we examine the likelihood of that actually happening and what it would mean in practical terms. My conclusion is climate change is not just a technical problem; it's a problem of power in a number of different ways. First of all, will solar and wind be able to solve the problem of climate change? Not very readily. They're both intermittent sources of energy, and even though the sun and wind are themselves renewable, the technologies are not. They're solar panels and wind turbines are made out of stuff we dig out of the ground and process using high heat industrial processes that themselves require, if not fossil fuels, then something very, very much like fossil fuels in order to work. And these sources of energy produce electricity directly, which is great in one sense, in that electricity is a very versatile energy carrier. But we use 80% of our energy currently in other forms, solid, liquid, and gaseous fuels. So all of the technologies that use those fuels are going to have to be switched in some way. And that's an absolutely mammoth infrastructure challenge. We're really talking, if we were going to somehow do this to make our current industrial technology, our current industrial world run entirely on renewable sources of energy, it would certainly be the biggest infrastructure project in the history of the world by a long shot. So when David Fridley and I examined the possibility of a renewable energy transition, we saw that scale is the biggest hurdle. If we try to replace all current energy usage quickly, actually the result will be a huge pulse in emissions, because building all of this stuff, not just the panels and turbines, but the industrial equipment and transportation devices, and all of this quickly is going to require an enormous amount of energy. And the 80%, 85% of the energy that we have currently to do it with is fossil fuels. So paradoxically, our effort to reduce carbon emissions could result in a huge pulse of carbon emissions unless we aim for a much smaller economy, lower energy usage, lower resource consumption, and so on. That's the only way it could possibly work. Inequality, briefly, there have been moments in the 20th century when economic inequality was pretty dramatically reduced, almost across the board around the world. And these were generally the result of 2 world wars and Great Depression. A very good book. I don't have the cover up here, but The Great Leveler is an excellent piece of economic research on tracking inequality during the last couple of hundred years, especially during the last century. And whenever we've had peace and things have been working generally well, the wealth pump gets going and inequality increases. And since the end of World War II, that's what's been basically going on. Inequality has been increasing rapidly and dramatically. And the whole basis of the production of global wealth is an inequality generating machine, if you want to think of it that way, a social machine. And this quote from Jason Hickel is very telling about the global production of wealth and distribution of wealth. So if we're over, my argument in much of the book is that we're overpowered. Fossil fuels and social inequality, social complexity have over-empowered us as a species and many humans within this species of Homo sapiens. And if we're going to survive, we're going to have to give up power. And particularly the humans who have the most of it are going to have to give up a lot of power. So are we even capable of power self-limitation? So this brings us back to what I was talking about earlier with the maximum power principle. If that's true, if maximum power is the organizing principle of evolution, then could it be that evolution itself has designed us to crash and burn? And there's basically nothing we can do about it. Well, I wanted to test that. And the more I thought about it, the more research I did, the more I realized that the maximum power principle, while it is certainly true, it does have an escape hatch, which I've called the optimum power principle, which simply says, the maximum power principle is true, but it's also true that ecosystems and sometimes individuals within species or species as a whole will limit power over the short run in order to survive for a longer period of time. Not always true, but homeostasis in individual organisms is basically a power balancing act that goes on 24/7. Power balancing in mechanisms in ecosystems include predator-prey relationships. And we humans have been doing this also ever since, particularly the origin of state societies. We've tried all kinds of things: democracy, financial regulations, progressive taxation. We tax rich people more, so to prevent extreme economic inequality. We have redistributive programs like Social Security, Medicare, so on, as ways of equaling out the power to some degree. So we know how to do this. Why isn't it working? Well, there are psychological reasons for it, and I discussed those at some length. But really, I think the biggest answer to that question is simply that fossil fuels gave us so much power so fast that we developed the idea, the myth, that somehow we humans are so special that limits no longer apply. Even if we use up even if we trash the Earth, we will continue evolving on other planets. We'll colonize the rest of the solar system, and then the galaxy, and finally the universe. There's nothing to stop us because we are uniquely powerful as a species. Well, of course, that's crazy. It's insanity. But what it does is it keeps us from examining the real limits that are confronting us and changing our behavior to adapt to those limits. It's sort of an anti-wisdom mythology, if you will. So if that's the case, then what's the future of power? The last chapter in the book is saying, well, okay, what's in store for us the rest of this century? And I don't know. There are too many moving parts. Nobody can predict. What we can say, I think, with some confidence, is that the future is bounded by two extreme possibilities. On the one extreme is self-annihilation. And I explore some of the pathways by which that can happen. And it's, unfortunately, I have to say, it's not that difficult to imagine. And on the other side, sufficient self-restraint. The only way we're going to prevent that self-annihilation is if we are able to restrain ourselves in some concrete ways, whether not just carbon emissions, but also land use, setting aside 50% of the planet for other species to recover, and banning certain especially hormone mimicking chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. All these are ways of giving up power. Social inequality. Rich people are going to have to be taxed at much higher rates. They're going to have to give up a lot of their wealth. And rich countries are going to have to give up many of their advantages over currently poor countries that are actually being systematically impoverished in order to make rich countries rich. That's not the path we're currently on. The path we're currently on is the one that's leading us, if not to extinction, then something very close to it. We are a very adaptable species, and it's entirely possible that even in the worst case scenario, some isolated pockets of Homo sapiens would survive. But nevertheless, it wouldn't be a very happy existence. That kind of speaks for itself. In our deep future, I think, we humans do have some pretty amazing abilities, our language, tool use, and so on. If we're not going to just get ourselves into trouble over and over again, how are we going to use these special abilities? Well, I think we could use them just by protecting beauty. There's what's called the Fermi paradox. Where is if there statistically there must be other intelligent species out there? So where are they? Where is everybody? One possible answer is that it's the nature of intelligent species to destroy themselves. But another answer to the Fermi paradox, which actually I don't see discussed in very many places, is that truly intelligent species come to grips with limits, environmental limits, and then decide to spend the rest of their time on their little planets just enjoying, enhancing, and protecting the beauty around them. What a great way to spend your time. And what a great way to spend your outsized abilities using language for poetry, for jokes, for plays and so on, rather than for dominating other human beings. So if we're going to get there, I think it's going to have to come about as a result of our fighting vertical power with more horizontal power and building alliances. Currently, there are lots of people working at limiting power through, weapons or carbon emissions or social inequality or whatever. All of these people are going to have to start seeing themselves as allies and breaking down the silos, which unfortunately our current nonprofit and foundation systems, they just encourage the silos rather than breaking them down to a large extent. Yeah. So this is the last slide. One of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite philosophers in all human history. And that's it. So let's talk.
Richard, that was wonderful. So many directions we could take this, but I want to read briefly from your advice to young people in the 21st century on page 332 of the book. This is what you're encouraging young people to do. Learn to grow food, study permaculture, learn to read people. You're going to need to know whether people are trustworthy. Be trustworthy. Otherwise, smart and trustworthy people won't associate with you. Learn to express yourself clearly and persuasively. It's okay not to reproduce. Learn to make decisions by consensus. Learn to repair and use simple technologies. Over the long term, you'll benefit more from learning to fix farming and construction tools and small engines. Learn to make spare parts from junk. Learn to defend yourself. Sadly, for the remainder of this century, the world is likely to be a more violent place. Learn to heal the human body via nutrition, herbs, and basic emergency care. Learn about nature. Memorize the names of local plants, birds, and insects. Learn to be comfortable in the wild. Learn to produce beauty via art, music, or movement. Learn to emotionally process trauma and grief and to help others to do so, and so forth. I didn't read them all, but that's quite a set of recommendations.
Yeah, at the end I say, nobody can do it all.
Right.
But do your best.
Right.
Yeah.
And in your sort of dichotomy with all the places in between, that either we learn self-restraint to restrain power, to focus on beauty and horizontal power, versus self-annihilation. And you kind of mention that maybe a few pockets of humanity will remain. But it seems to me that there's another option that is somewhat hopeful, which is implicit in a lot that you said, which is that, yes, there's going to be a lot of tragedy, but that a sufficient number of human beings, not just a few pockets, will reconstitute a life-affirming civilization.
Yeah.
It seems to me, I think that's the thrust of your book, but in your summary, it was self-annihilation versus, and I just wanted to emphasize that center point.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I hope I didn't give the wrong impression. Those are the two ends of the spectrum, but there's a lot of space in between.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll land it further toward the sufficient self-restraint end of the spectrum. But the book is, the dedication of the book is for the survivors.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I hope, the message of this book, if not the book itself, I don't have any great hopes that, millions of people will read the book or anything like that. But I hope that the essence of the book somehow is transmitted. That the need for power self-limitation, the need to learn once again how to the wisdom of self-control.
I'm going to read three questions together so that you can make little notes and decide how you want to answer. Marianne Mott said, in the course of your research, did you come across Alice Friedman's Life After Fossil Fuels? Could you comment? Randy Hayes said, Richard, what did you learn about violent revolution to stop governing that large people didn't like? Did any lead to significantly better world? Actually, you do talk about violent protest in the book as sometimes useful. Jim Quay says, limiting our power will require great restraint. The wager of democracy is this can be done through education and persuasion. The wager of authoritarian states is it must be done by compulsion. If persuasion appears not to be working, see the Ministry for the Future. Alternative to violent compulsion is there. So those are three questions. And friends, I welcome you to put up more.
Yeah. Alice Friedman's work is excellent. And I know Alice, and she's a terrific energy analyst, and she's written several books, one of which is called When the Trucks Stop Running. So her point is electric cars are pretty easy. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit of electrifying transportation. But trucks, which we currently depend on to move all sorts of stuff, especially in North America, very hard to electrify big trucks. And so what does that mean for the future of consumer society? And well, anyway, Alice Friedman is a terrific analyst. I recommend her work. Violent revolution. What are the typical results through history? Well, I mean, they are moments when extreme power is unseated, but that doesn't mean that the result is necessarily better. It can result in just a switch of who has the power, as we saw with the Russian Revolution of 1917. The extreme economic inequality of the pre-revolutionary society gave way to a situation where the communist apparatchiks then held enormous power, and Stalin, of course, caused the deaths of millions of Russians through starvation and gulags and so on, work camps. So revolutions have a pretty checkered history of succeeding in the long run at creating horizontal power. Nevertheless, there are some sort of shining moments in history where, for short periods of time at least, leveling efforts seemed to work. During famously during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, parts of Spain actually were taken over, or self-organized by anarchists, and did reasonably well, but only for a short period of time until they were defeated by Franco's forces. Education or compulsion as paths forward. Well, the problem with compulsion is that it always sooner or later results in folks resisting. It leads to resistance to the compulsion. Sometimes much later, we could be talking hundreds of years. Extremely unequal societies have, in some cases, lasted 1,000 years. So it's not immediate, it's not automatic, but it does. The response is eventual and inevitable.
It's an question. Yeah. Whether Daniel Ellsberg commented recently on the invasive technologies that we live with, and he said, while we may not yet live in a totalitarian society, all the levers of totalitarianism are in place. So one wonders whether compulsion may not be more lasting when the new technologies enable the levels of intrusion for unbelievable levels of social control.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm in touch with a number of folks who are really concerned about the environmental crises that we face, and who believe that the only way that we're going to solve them is through some sort of compulsory law, compulsory birth control, compulsory carbon limits, rationing, etc. And I have to say they make good points. If we just rely on education, will we be able to get far enough, fast enough to avert some kind of calamity?
You cite someone who you actually introduced me to, and I find one of the most extraordinary futurists we've had, David Fleming. His book, Survive the Future. Could you say a little about Fleming's vision? And because you talk about it in the book.
Yeah, let me see. I think I have.
Well, you have his.
I have Lean Logic here.
Right.
But I.
That's the big book.
Yeah, that's the big book. But the one that's more accessible is called Surviving the Future. I don't see it right next to me, but it's a fantastic book. I was fortunate to know David. He died in 2010. He was an economist, but he was an economist who saw human beings multidimensionally, not just as dollar signs and benefit maximizing machines. And he believed that the pathway to not just a survivable future, but a stable, sustainable future included festival. That we are creatures who love to enjoy ourselves and celebrate, and we always have through seasonal ceremonies and festivals, as I wrote about in an ancient book of mine called Celebrate the Solstice, all the way through history. And festival is a way of bringing people together in a context that's obviously celebratory, and getting them in sync with one another and able to work together agreeably to get stuff done.
Anna O'Malley, wonderful physician colleague, writes, I'll soon be making a presentation at a conference of integrative medicine practitioners that part of our role in society at this planetary moment is to promote individual and community resilience in many ways you poignantly suggest to youth. Do you have suggestions for community building among leaders across sectors in this effort, a sangha of sorts for supportive engagement and cross-pollination?
Right. Yeah. My organization, Post Carbon Institute, has been holding this banner for several years of building community resilience. And I'd like to be able to say that we've had, all of these practical successes with this community and that community and so on. We have worked with other organizations like the Transition Network, the Transition Towns, because we like their organizing methodology. But even there, there's been more success in some places, like particularly in Britain, than in the US. So I don't have a magic formula. The Stockholm Resilience Center has done a lot of really good work in terms of producing a a scheme for assessing levels of community resilience, which, you have to start somewhere. So assessing where a community is on and in various aspects: food system, energy system, water, homeless, crime rates. All of these things can be assessed that way, and then you know where to focus. But you have to get the community leadership on board with it. Basically, all of the stakeholders in the community have to be involved. So it's not just about getting the city council in on the process, but if they aren't, then you're not going to accomplish very much. So there are. And if you've been working on community resilience building, you probably know everything already that I just said. But nevertheless, that's what we've learned so far.
Our colleague and friend Tom Kruse from Rockefeller Brothers Fund says festivals can also help limit accumulation, level and limit, which is an important point. Right. One thing that didn't come up, and our colleague Pete Myers is all over this issue, is that when you talked about limiting population, you didn't reference the incredibly important work that Shauna Swan has done. Are you familiar with her work?
Yes, I actually do cite it in the book. I wasn't able to mention it in my little brief summary at the start of our session. But yeah, I mean, when we talk about, that's the irony of talking about population. Population is overpopulation is a real and enormous problem, and it contributes to climate change and all biodiversity loss and all these other problems. And yet, at the same time, on the other hand, we may be facing a crisis of in which reproduction becomes next to impossible because of all of the hormone mimicking chemicals in the environment. And not only for human beings, but for other species as well. In some way, that's the scariest factoid I've ever seen, is that chart of Shauna Swan showing average male sperm counts declining to 0 by 2045. Of course, that's just an average, but nevertheless, I mean, that's just gobsmacking. So one of our top priorities certainly has to be reducing the power of the petrochemical industry to produce these pollutants.
Yeah, I apologize that I missed that in the book. Can you imagine, as we watch these horrible scenes at the American southern border and in Europe, where people are trying to stop massive migration from the global south to safer places? Can you imagine that as that takes place, that it will turn out that where there are pockets of fertile younger people who are able to work, the dynamics of those borders will change, and that as people try to come into Europe and North America and other relatively affluent places and try to move up toward northern areas where it will be possible to survive, we may be welcoming significant.
That political dynamic could very well change. I hope so. I mean, right now, the most likely scenario is for massive migration to cause more kinds of political disruption and inhumane, behavior, treatment of others. So,
absolutely. So, other questions? Let's see. I think I just saw one. Go put your questions in so that we can talk to Richard about them. I certainly have other things to ask myself. I was thinking about the book that, how close it is to spiritual injunctions, and you cite a whole bunch of them, that essentially that in addition to, physician, heal thyself, and, Plato, know thyself, that self-mastery, self-restraint is one of the key human spiritual injunctions. To be master of yourself, you quote Milton, is to be more than a king. And then you quote all the thinkers about how to live frugally or with very little. Muhammad saying, my poverty is my wealth. So what's really interesting here is that in a lot of the great religious traditions, precisely the spiritual injunctions, which are part of our genetic heritage and our cultural heritage, are the injunctions that if practiced, would enable us to survive better.
Right. And one of the sad parts of the development of consumerism, right, was that those cultural injunctions got waylaid, got down, turned aside, and forgotten. So, parents used to teach their children the value of frugality and learning how to take care of things and recycle things and reuse things and so on. And now, of course, that's just that's ancient stuff. One of the areas that I was kind of excited to do some research on in the book was what's called the axial age in history. Roughly, we're talking about 1500 to 500 BC or so, and then continuing a little after, which was the period where the monotheism and the world religions that now claim so many hundreds of millions of adherents got their start. Previous to that time, religion was not a moralizing force in human society. And particularly going back into hunter-gatherer times, there wasn't even what we necessarily call religion. There certainly was spirituality and shamanistic practices and so on. But it's only in the axial age that we get big gods. And I recommend a book by that title by Era Noranzarian. And he traces the evolution of big gods and why this happened. Essentially, it was related to this process of social evolution, whereby societies were getting bigger and bigger. And as empires emerged, you had societies composed largely of strangers, people who came from different cultures, had different traditions, different languages. So how do you get all these people on the same page? Well, if you can get them all to agree on a big God religion, where there's a deity, an all-seeing deity who's constantly monitoring your behavior, so that religion is all about proving your dedication to the big God through going to church and making donations and adhering to the rules and so on. Then everybody becomes more trustworthy, and this has practical implications for trade. If you're trading with other people of the same religion, there's a better likelihood that you can trust the person you're trading with. So this was an evolutionary development, and it was also in many ways a corrective to the extremes of inequality. Social inequality that had developed with the origin of the first state societies several thousand years earlier. Now suddenly religion becomes more about equality and peace and justice. These ideas emerge with the big God religions, with the axial age, and they've been in many ways a benefit to humanity. They're, of course, proving that you're a good Christian or whatever is one of the ways of doing so can be, going out and slaughtering non-believers. So there's a lot that these religions have to answer for as well. But nevertheless, the good bits deserve to be preserved in whatever way we can.
Yeah, Nietzsche famously called Christianity a slave religion. And one could extend that to other religions that promote, equity and peacefulness and so forth. Two questions. Sandra Weil says, I hesitate to mention Rudolf Steiner's writing on the threefold social order, but are you familiar with it and do you find his vision helpful? And Jim Quay says, your reference to the axial age, whence many of our ethical and religious injunctions originated, makes me wonder whether already existing injunctions are adequate or new ones are necessary. That's an interesting question. Yeah. On either of those.
Yeah, I can't say much about Steiner. I read some of Steiner back in the 70s and early 80s, and I haven't refreshed my acquaintance with his writing since then.
He started biodynamic gardening.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah,
close to your thesis. Yeah,
right. I know who Steiner was, and I have a lot of respect for him, but I just haven't refreshed my. Yeah. So I can't speak to that. Do we need new injunctions post-axial age? Absolutely. I think what humanity is going through now in terms of evolutionary phases is far more profound in its ultimate implications than the origin of state societies, the axial age, or even the beginning of the fossil fuel era. Certainly, of those three, the fossil fuel era has had the greatest implications so far. I mean, in just 200 years, look what's happened. Human society has changed in far more profound ways than at any previous time. But the fossil fuel age now is giving way to something else. What is it? And that's yet to be determined, and we are part of that. We are part of that process. But there will certainly be new injunctions, and I think they will have a lot to do with power self-limitation and with horizontal social power, how that works, how it's maintained.
James Stark from the Regenerative Design Institute is a great regenerative agriculturalist, horticulturalist, says, in your research and look to the possible future, what role and importance do you see the feminine playing? And, I was thinking about that too as I read your book, because it really did seem that the values and horizontal power and sharing and so on and so forth is, a quintessentially and deeply feminine vision. When we think about the movement from the big God religions of our time, which tend, broadly speaking, to be patriarchal, the recovery of the divine feminine, both within those religions and beyond them, it just seems like a really profound thing, as does the fact that with the pandemic, a lot of the countries that have done the best were run by women. So
yeah.
One really does wonder whether a fundamental dimension of this shift is toward a world in which feminine governance and wisdom plays a much more profound role.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Where to start? One thing, looking at violence, which I did in the course of this book, because violence is one way that humans exert power over one another. It's one of the main channels of vertical social power. And it's very clear that men are responsible for roughly 90% of violent acts in most countries where such statistics are kept. Mm-hmm. So the more patriarchal the society, the more violent it's likely to be. And the role of women in society has changed pretty dramatically from period to period. With the advent of early state societies, the self-determination of women took a huge dip from which we're still recovering. And that was partly because these were societies organized around cities, and cities are inherently very unhealthy places. People living in close quarters, and at that time, of course, humans hadn't developed an accommodation to a lot of infectious diseases that, measles and things like that. So diseases were rampant. Poor sanitation hadn't been developed. So these were very unhealthy places. People died at early ages in large numbers. And so the only way to maintain these kinds of urban societies was to constantly import new human beings from the countryside. So that meant conquering other surrounding peoples and capturing them and enslaving them and raping the women, forcing them to have children and incorporating them into the society, and also forcing the women who are part of your society to have as many children as possible. So the role of women in society came to be that of, domestic work and child rearing and producing as many offspring as possible. And again, we've been recovering from that ever since. And in the book, I think, the permaculturists have probably got it right in that agriculture has always entailed large doses of social inequality. And before agriculture, there was a stage in between hunting and gathering and agriculture, which anthropologists call horticulture, typically divided into simple and complex horticultural societies. And horticultural societies are often matrifocal and matrilineal. And the status of women in these societies is typically quite high. So I think we'd be better off if we were a gardening society. And permaculture, of course, that was part of the vision of the originators of permaculture all the way back in the 1970s. So I think they got it right. And the more we can grow our own food and do it on in an ecological way, permaculture way, the better off we'll be, not only physically and environmentally, but also socially.
It's interesting that endocrine disrupting chemicals are often feminizing hormones. So, just in terms of the ways we've chosen to poison ourselves, at least moving us in some ways toward a greater expression. One of the people that you cite frequently is Peter Turchin, and his work on studying cultural evolution via group selection, shifts in food production and social organization, and how they were motivated primarily by population growth and warfare. But you found Turchin to be important to your work. Could you say more about him?
Yeah, I've the more I read Turchin, the more I learn about him, the more I respect his work. He was an insect evolutionary biologist who studied insects. And he basically solved a whole series of key problems in that field, and using lots of data and data analysis and methods that he developed along with a small team working with him. And he said, well, the methodology works. Is there something more important I can apply this methodology to? Well, how about human social evolution? And so he did. And he and his colleagues have this database that I mentioned earlier, Sheshak, it's called. It's named after an Egyptian goddess, the Egyptian goddess of statistics or something like that. Anyway, they've really been able to make a lot of reliable inferences from the data that I think are extremely helpful in better understanding, who we are as humans, how we come to be how we come to live the way we live, from a social standpoint, and the dynamics of the kinds of society that we're living in, the unstable dynamics and what that tends to look like.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Is Turchin's work widely accepted among academics?
Yes. I mean, there are folks. I mean, for example, Steven
Pinker?
Yeah, Pinker.
Yeah.
Is one of those evolutionary biologist thinkers who dismisses the whole idea of multi-level selection, and therefore doesn't have any use for Turchin's work. But I think that's just a perverse ideological reaction, and because if you look at the work of Turchin and his colleagues, they're attacking interesting questions and important questions. They're doing so in a systematic way that makes sense, and they're coming up with useful answers. So just complaining that multi-level selection is not good evolutionary biology, it seems to me to be totally beside the point.
We have about 7 minutes left. And, first of all, thank you. I'll thank you again at the end. But now that you've written this, now that the book is out, you're giving talks and having conversations. Do you have any sense of where you will go from here?
Well, to tell you the truth, I think this book is going to be sort of my marker in the sand. I don't anticipate, writing another big picture book like this anytime in the future. This has been a big effort, and I feel like it's a summary of everything that I've worked on in my adult academic creative life. So I don't have any other plans in that sense. I do intend to keep writing. The previous book, Our Renewable Future, that I talked about earlier, we're talking about the possibility of bringing that back up to date. Talking about energy, of course, the statistics are always changing, and the renewable energy world is very different today than it was 5 years ago when we were doing our research for the first edition of that. So one project is just to bring that up to date.
You were perhaps premature with many other people in assuming that we were at peak oil. Right. And have said so publicly, and you clearly weren't alone. Where do you, but the underlying analysis still seems really interesting, because on the one hand, it's getting more and more expensive to find new sources of hydrocarbons. On the other hand, they keep inventing new technologies and keep finding them. And of course, it's going to kill us if they keep. But nobody has developed a very persuasive analysis of how we're going to get people to, quote, keep it in the ground. So I just wonder, where are you as you look back on your, it's like being prematurely anti-fascist. You were right, but you were too early for people to grok it. Now, as you look back and look forward at the energy equation, how do you see it? Where do you see us going?
Right. Well, yeah, you're right. There are some things that we did not see coming. I didn't, back in 2003, when I wrote The Party's Over, I did not foresee the fracking revolution that would occur, starting starting roughly around 2010. But that said, there were some things that we did get right, and I think we deserve, us old peak oilers deserve some credit for. Regular conventional oil production did stop growing around 2005. The unconventional oil that's taken over growth, what's produced by fracking, the Canadian tar sands, the ultra deep water oil, in the Gulf of Mexico and other places off Brazil. These are sources that have a short shelf life, particularly fracking, I would say. That's not so much true with tar sands, but the tar sands these are completely different categories. They're different discussions. But fracking is what gets most people's attention because it really was a miracle. I mean, the U.S. oil production is higher now than it was at its peak in the early 1970s, and no one was foreseeing that back when I was writing. Certainly not us peak oilers or anyone else for that matter. Not that the oil industry itself didn't foresee it. But I wrote a book on fracking called Snake Oil, where and we've done a lot of expert analysis at Post Carbon Institute on the prospects for tight oil, and they're not particularly good because individual wells deplete so quickly. You have to drill and drill and drill. The core areas that are profitable for production get drilled really quickly, and that's happened in most of the plays already. The only one where increased production is still possible or likely is southern Texas. And elsewhere, I mean, North Dakota is already in decline. World oil production hit its peak so far in November 2018, and it's generally down since then, substantially down since the start of the pandemic. Is it possible it could still set another record? Yes, but probably only for a short period of time. World natural gas production likely to peak this decade. World coal production possibly has already peaked as a result of China. China's coal production is down now, and China's coal production and consumption is so high that it basically shapes the global situation. So one of the things that I think the whole peak oil discussion brought out that is really important to the whole resource conversation is the whole low-hanging fruit principle of resource extraction. We go after the cheap, easy stuff first, and even though there's always more left, over time it gets more difficult, more expensive, more environmentally ruinous to produce. And of course, that's exactly what's happened over the last 15, 20 years since this conversation started. So I think it's helped some people understand that, but others, it's sad to see that the failure of a few unwise predictions about when global oil production would peak have led many people to dismiss the whole idea that these resources are even limited. They seem to have concluded that we will always have more to find, and we will always invent a new technology to dig deeper or process lower grade resources, and therefore it's not a thing. But no.
Well, as they say, nature bats last, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Richard Heinberg, it is such a pleasure to be back with you. I find this to be an extraordinarily important book. I note that you had to publish it with a wonderful small publisher, and I had exchanges with you in which I said, I thought this should be very widely available. So I hope for this wonderful New Society Publishers that it's an immense success. And I'll be very curious to see whether your thinking on power becomes a tool for organizing and advocacy. It's one thing to use energy as a tool for organizing and advocacy, carbon. But the question, which we don't have time to address today, is what are the uses of this profound analysis of power to help move us toward a more just and sustainable world? And it will be very interesting to discover.
Yeah, that's a great conversation to have, and I would happily join it with you and others.
Well, let's look forward to that. That gives us the subject for our next conversation. So, Richard Heinberg, thank you so much for joining us at the New School. We're getting thanks from Angela and Marianne Mott and Brandon Stoll and others. I'm going to turn it back to Kira for a close. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Richard. It's great to have you back. And Michael, it's fabulous to have you back as well. Again, we'll have the recordings from this conversation up in about a week or two. And you can find all of our recordings, including this one, on our website, tns.commonweal.org. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Wonderful to be with you.